is growing. War on this country will come soon, for Sauron will have dominion over all life on this.
Who now has the strength to stand against Isengard and the union of the two towers?
The strength of the ring-bearer is failing. Preacher Gollum senses the ring.
The thieves, my precious.
I come back to you now, at the turn of the...
What if I told you this movie changed fantasy films forever? Here are amazing facts and my honest review of The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers 2002. You're watching SA Film Facts. Let's begin The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers is a huge fantasy adventure movie that came out in 2002. It was directed by Peter Jackson and based on the second book in J.R.R. Tolkien's famous The Lord of the Rings series. The screenplay was written by Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, Steven Sinclair, and Peter Jackson. This movie is the sequel to The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring 2001, and is the second movie in the legendary trilogy. The movie has an amazing cast including Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Kate Blanchett, John Rhys-Davies, Bernard Hill, Christopher Lee, Billy Boyd, Dominic Monaghan, Orlando Bloom, Hugo Weaving, Miranda Otto, David Venom, Brad Dourif, Carl Urban, and Andy Serkis. The story picks up right where the first movie left off and follows three different adventures happening at the same time. Frodo and Sam keep traveling toward Mordor to destroy the One Ring before it falls into the wrong hands. Along the way, they team up with Gollum, the ring's former owner. Even though Gollum knows the way, he's sneaky, unpredictable, and can't really be trusted, which makes their journey even more dangerous. At the same time, Merry and Pippin manage to escape from the orcs who captured them. While running through the forest, they meet Treebeard, a giant living tree known as an Ent. Together, they convince the Ents to fight back against Saruman and launch a powerful attack on Isengard, where Saruman has been building his army. Meanwhile, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli continue their mission and travel to the kingdom of Rohan, where war is about to break out. They are shocked and excited when they reunite with Gandalf, who has returned stronger than ever after his battle with the Balrog. The group joins King Theoden and the people of Rohan as they prepare for one of the greatest battles ever shown on screen, the epic Battle of Helm's Deep. Together, they stand against Saruman's massive army in a fight for survival. Even though the movie was paid for and released by the American studio New Line Cinema, the entire film was shot and edited in Peter Jackson's home country of New Zealand. All three movies in the trilogy were filmed around the same time, which helped keep the story, characters, and world feeling connected from beginning to end. The Two Towers had its world premiere on December 5, 2002, in New York City before hitting theaters across the United States on December 18 and opening in New Zealand the next day. As soon as it was released, both fans and critics loved it. People were blown away by its incredible action scenes, emotional story, beautiful music, amazing acting, and groundbreaking visual effects. Gollum became one of the biggest highlights of the movie because his realistic CGI was unlike anything audiences had ever seen before. The movie was also a huge success at the box office, earning over $923 million worldwide during its original theater run. It became the highest grossing movie of 2002 and was one of the biggest movies ever released at that time. After later re releases, its total worldwide earnings reached around $944 million. Over the years, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers has become one of the most respected fantasy movies ever made. Many fans and critics consider it one of the greatest sequels in movie history because it builds on the first film while making the story even bigger, darker, and more exciting. The movie received many awards and was nominated for six Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It won Oscars for Best Sound Editing and Best Visual Effects, proving just how impressive it was, both technically and creatively. The story finally comes to an epic conclusion in the third movie, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, which was released in 2003 and completed one of the most celebrated movie trilogies of all time. The movie kicks off by taking us back to the ending of the first film. This time, we see Gandalf's battle with the Balrog from his point of view. Instead of ending when they fall off the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the scene continues as both of them keep fighting while falling deep into the darkness below. Frodo wakes up from a troubling dream and continues his dangerous journey with his best friend Sam. As they travel through the rocky hills, they're suddenly attacked by Gollum, a strange creature completely obsessed with getting back the one ring which he calls his precious. He believes Frodo stole it from him and will do anything to take it back. Frodo and Sam manage to capture Gollum by tying him up with the magical elven rope that Galadriel gave Sam. Sam doesn't trust Gollum at all and wants to leave him behind. But Frodo understands how badly the ring has affected him. Since they're lost and don't know the way to Mordor, Frodo decides to let Gollum guide them to the Black Gate. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Rohan, a group of Uruk-hai races across the open fields while dragging Merry and Pippin as prisoners. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chase after them without stopping, running for 3 straight days. Legolas figures out that the orcs are heading toward Isengard, where the evil wizard Saruman is building a massive army for Sauron. Things aren't looking good in Rohan. King Theoden has become weak and confused because he's under the control of his advisor Grima Wormtongue. Unknown to the king, Grima is secretly working for Saruman and is slowly destroying the kingdom from the inside. Orcs and the wild men of Dunland attack villages across the land, killing innocent people, including Theoden's only son, Theodred. Eomer, the king's brave nephew, realizes Grima is a traitor. He also notices that Grima has creepy feelings for Eowyn, Eomer's sister. After confronting him, Eomer is unfairly kicked out of Rohan for speaking against the king's advisor. Refusing to give up, he leaves to gather loyal riders who are still willing to fight for their homeland. Back on Frodo and Sam's journey, Gollum leads them through the creepy dead marshes. The swamp is filled with the ghostly faces of warriors who died long ago, making the place feel dark and haunted. They also barely avoid a ring wraith flying overhead on a terrifying winged beast. When they finally reach the Black Gate of Mordor, they realize it's heavily guarded by enemy soldiers, making it impossible to get through. Gollum then tells them he knows another secret path into Mordor. Sam still doesn't believe a single word Gollum says, but Frodo decides to trust him one more time. At the same time, Eomer and his riders launch a surprise attack on the orcs and Uruk-hai during the night. The battle wipes out almost the entire enemy group. During all the chaos, Merry and Pippin escape into Fangorn Forest, where they meet Treebeard, the oldest and wisest of the giant walking trees known as the Ents. Later, Eomer runs into Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and tells them that no one survived the battle with the orcs. Still hoping their friends are alive, Aragorn carefully studies the ground and discovers hobbit footprints leading into Fangorn Forest. While searching the forest, the three friends come across a mysterious old wizard. To their surprise, it's Gandalf, who has returned after defeating the Balrog. Now stronger than before, he is known as Gandalf the White. The group rides to the capital city of Edoras, where Gandalf frees King Theoden from Saruman's control. Wormtongue is exposed as a traitor and driven out of the kingdom. Once Theoden regains his senses, he is heartbroken to learn that his son has died. Instead of risking an open battle, he decides to move his people to Helm's Deep, a powerful fortress that has protected Rohan many times before. Gandalf leaves to find Eomer and his riders, promising to return within 5 days. During the trip to Helm's Deep, Eowyn begins to develop feelings for Aragorn. Meanwhile, Wormtongue rushes back to Saruman and tells him that Rohan has broken free from his control. Furious, Saruman orders his army to completely destroy the kingdom. Far away in Ithilien, Gollum struggles with his own mind. One side of him wants to help Frodo, while the darker side still wants the ring for himself. For a short time, his kinder side seems to win. Frodo and Sam soon witness a surprise attack on enemy soldiers, but before they can escape, they're captured by the Rangers of Gondor. At the same time, Theoden's people continue their journey toward Helm's Deep. Suddenly, Saruman sends deadly wargs and orc riders to attack them. A fierce battle breaks out, and Aragorn bravely fights to protect everyone. During the fight, he's pulled off a cliff by a warg and falls into a raging river below. Believing Aragorn is dead, the survivors are heartbroken but have no choice except to continue toward Helm's Deep without him. Back in Rivendell, Elrond realizes that the time of the elves is slowly coming to an end. He tells his daughter Arwen that she should leave Middle Earth and sail to the Grey Heavens before it's too late. To help her understand, Elrond shows her a vision of the future. In the vision, even if Aragorn defeats Sauron and becomes the king of Gondor, he is still human and will eventually grow old and die. Arwen would be left alone with a broken heart, forced to live without the man she loves. Even though it hurts, she sadly agrees to leave. Meanwhile, Frodo and Sam are captured by the Rangers of Gondor and taken to their hidden base at Heneth Anun. There they meet Faramir, the younger brother of Boromir. Unlike his brother, Faramir has never met Frodo before and doesn't fully understand how dangerous the One Ring really is. At the same time, Gollum manages to escape after Frodo unknowingly tricks him into a trap. Once Faramir discovers that Frodo is carrying the One Ring, he sees it as a chance to finally earn his father's respect. Believing the ring could help Gondor in the war, he decides to take Frodo and the ring to the city instead of letting them continue toward Mordor. Back in Rohan, Aragorn survives his fall into the river. He wakes up on the riverbank after his loyal horse Brago nudges him back to consciousness. Even though he's injured and exhausted, Aragorn quickly gets back on his horse and races toward Helm's Deep. Along the way, he sees Saruman's enormous army marching across the land. There are around 10,000 Uruk-hai heading straight for the fortress, making it clear that Rohan is about to face an impossible battle. When Aragorn finally reaches Helm's Deep, everyone is relieved to see he's alive. But the good news doesn't last long. They only have about 300 soldiers ready to defend the fortress against an army thousands of times larger. Just when hope starts to fade, a group of elven warriors from Lorien arrives to help. Led by Haldir, they stand beside the people of Rohan, ready to fight until the very end. Meanwhile, deep inside Fangorn Forest, Merry, Pippin, Treebeard, and the other Ents gather for a meeting to decide whether they should join the war against Saruman. The discussion takes a long time, and in the end, the Ents decide they don't want to get involved. As night falls and heavy rain pours down, the legendary Battle of Helm's Deep begins. Arrows fly through the air as the soldiers of Rohan and the elves defend the walls. Huge ladders are raised against the fortress, allowing waves of Uruk-hai to climb up and attack. Even though the defenders fight bravely, the enemy keeps pushing forward. Saruman's army then unleashes a powerful explosive that blows a massive hole in the fortress wall. The Uruk-hai charge through the opening, forcing Aragorn, Gimli, and the others to fall back. The battle becomes even more desperate as the enemy breaks through the gates and storms into the fortress. During the fierce fighting, Haldir is killed while protecting the defenders, and the surviving elves retreat deeper into the stronghold alongside the people of Rohan back in Fangorn Forest. Pippin refuses to accept the Ent's decision to stay out of the war. He cleverly leads Treebeard to an area where Saruman has destroyed countless ancient trees to fuel his war machine. Seeing the destruction of his forest fills Treebeard with anger. Furious at Saruman's betrayal, he finally calls on all the Ents to fight back. Together, they begin the legendary last march of the Ents and head toward Isengard. At Helm's Deep, the situation grows even worse. The defenders are nearly out of options, and the fortress is close to falling. Remembering Gandalf's promise, Aragorn leads one final cavalry charge straight into the enemy army. It looks like a hopeless last stand as they are surrounded on every side. Then, just when everything seems lost, Gandalf returns exactly as he promised. Riding beside Eomer and thousands of Rohirrim warriors, he charges down the hillside and crashes into Saruman's army. The Uruk-hai are completely overwhelmed and forced into the nearby Horn Forest, where they meet their final fate. At the same time, the Ents launch their attack on Isengard. They tear down walls, throw massive rocks, and destroy Saruman's defenses. They even break a huge dam, sending a powerful flood rushing through Isengard and leaving the fortress completely underwater. Later, at the ruined city of Osgiliath, Faramir, Frodo, and Sam are suddenly attacked by a ring wraith riding a terrifying flying creature. Frodo nearly falls under the ring's influence, but Sam pulls him back before it's too late. Seeing Frodo's courage and hearing Sam's heartfelt words about never giving up, Faramir finally realizes that the ring must never fall into anyone's hands. He lets Frodo and Sam continue their mission to destroy it. As the movie comes to an end, Gandalf and the leaders of the Free Peoples understand that the war has only just begun. Even though Saruman has been defeated, Sauron is still growing stronger and a much bigger battle lies ahead. The future of Middle Earth now depends on Frodo and Sam as they continue their dangerous journey toward Mordor with Gollum once again leading the way. But after feeling betrayed and mistreated, Gollum's darker personality takes over once more. Secretly planning to steal back the One Ring, he decides to lead Frodo and Sam toward a mysterious creature he simply calls her, setting up the next chapter of their adventure, the casting of The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers 2002 stands as a masterclass in assembling an ensemble that could shoulder the weight of J.R.R. Tolkien's expansive world while delivering performances that elevated the epic beyond spectacle. Peter Jackson's vision required actors who could convey ancient heroism, quiet vulnerability, moral complexity, and monstrous duality across intertwined storylines. Um, Rohan's defense, the Ents March, Frodo's perilous journey with Gollum, and the siege at Helm's Deep. The choices blended established talent with fresh faces, returning fellowship members with new additions, creating a cohesive cast that felt lived in despite the film's massive scale. Viggo Mortensen's Aragorn anchors much of the human drama in The Two Towers. Cast after a late replacement in The Fellowship of the Ring, Mortensen fully embodied the ranger turned king in this middle chapter. His portrayals deepens Aragorn's reluctance and resolve as he aids Rohan. Mortensen performed many of his own stunts, including intense fight choreography during the Warg attack and the desperate race to Helm's Deep. His chemistry with Bernard Hill's Theoden and Miranda Otto's Eowyn grounds the Rohan storyline in emotional realism. Mortensen's commitment extended to learning swordsmanship, riding, and even composing elements of the character's presence on set, influencing how Aragorn evolves from wanderer to leader. His quiet intensity in scenes like the vision of Arwen or rallying speeches captures the character's internal conflict between personal desire and duty, making Aragorn a believable bridge between the mythical and the mortal. Ian McKellen returns as Gandalf, now the White after his resurrection. McKellen's performance shifts from the warm, guiding wizard of the first film to a more commanding strategic figure. His arrival at Edoras and the exorcism like confrontation with Theoden under Saruman's influence showcase McKellen's theatrical range, drawing on his Shakespearean background to convey ancient power and compassion. The physical transformation, white robes, renewed vigor, pairs with subtle vocal modulations that signal Gandalf's elevated status. McKellen's on-set leadership helped unify the cast during the grueling New Zealand shoots, much as his character unites the forces of Rohan. His interactions with the younger actors, particularly in mentoring moments, add layers of mentorship and prophecy that propel the narrative. Elijah Wood as Frodo Baggins and Sean Astin as Samwise Gamgee continue their harrowing journey, with the casting proving its strength in the intimate, psychologically intense Mordor adjacent scenes. Wood's Frodo grows visibly burdened by the ring's corruption, his wide eyes conveying mounting despair and temptation. The decision to keep Wood in the role across the trilogy allowed for a continuous arc of deterioration that feels authentic. Aston Sam provides the emotional counterbalance, loyalty, simple courage, and quiet heroism. Their dynamic with Andy Serkis's Gollum forms the film's most innovative character interplay. The trio's scenes in the Emin Mule and beyond required precise timing and emotional layering, especially as Sam grows suspicious of Gollum while Frodo extends pity. Aston's everyman quality makes Sam's devotion relatable, turning what could be sentimental into profound. Andy Serkis' Gollum Smeagol represents one of the most groundbreaking casting and performance choices in cinematic history. Serkis was initially brought in for voice work and motion capture, but his full body performance and vocal duality became central. In The Two Towers, Gollum's introduction as a tracker evolves into a complex, tragic figure torn between his better nature Smeagol and the ring's hold. Serkis' physical contortions, rasping voice shifts, and expressive eyes, enhanced by Veta Digital, created a fully realized character that blurred live action and CGI. The Gollum and Smeagol debate scene, where the two personalities argue, showcases Serkis' ability to perform against himself, requiring multiple takes that were seamlessly composited. This performance not only advanced motion capture technology but added psychological depth, making Gollum a pitiable antagonist rather than a mere monster. Jackson's trust in Serkis to improvise and layer the character paid immense dividends, influencing countless subsequent VFX driven roles. John Rhys Davies as Gimli brings robust comic relief and warrior spirit to the Aragorn Legolas Gimli trio. His casting leaned into the actor's booming voice and physical presence, augmented by prosthetics and forced perspective for the dwarf's stature. In The Two Towers, Gimli's humor, grumbling about riding horses, axe wielding bravado at Helm's Deep, lightens tense moments without undermining the stakes. Rhys Davies' rapport with Orlando Bloom's Legolas and Mortensen's Aragorn fosters the camaraderie that defines the Fellowship remnants. The actor's enthusiasm for practical effects and stunts added authenticity to battle sequences, where Gimli's feats like the Orc body count contest highlight his loyalty and skill. Orlando Bloom as Legolas continues his graceful elven archery prowess. Bloom's youthful energy and athleticism suited the character's agility, evident in the Warg battle and Helm's Deep's deep defenses. His casting emphasized the ethereal quality of elves, with subtle makeup enhancing otherworldly poise. Legolas' loyalty to Aragorn and growing friendship with Gimli provide emotional through lines, while his keen senses drive key plot points. Bloom trained extensively in archery and wire work, contributing to fluid action sequences that contrast the heavier human and dwarf styles. Dominic Monaghan's as Mary and Billy Boyd as Pippin inject levity and heart into the end storyline. Their escape from the Uruk-hai and meeting with Treebeard required a blend of youthful mischief and growing maturity. Monaghan and Boyd's real life friendship translated into authentic on screen banter, making their persuasion of the Ents believable. Their casting as the mischievous hobbits allowed for natural chemistry that humanizes the larger conflicts, particularly as they witness Saruman's deforestation and spur the Ents to action. The actors' performances ground the fantastical Entmoot in relatable urgency. Bernard Hill's Theoden emerges as one of the standout additions in The Two Towers. Cast as the King of Rohan, Hill brought Shakespearean gravitas to the role of a ruler broken by Saruman's influence and personal loss. His transformation from a frail, aged puppet to a revitalized warrior king is mesmerizing, achieved largely through practical makeup and Hill's committed acting rather than heavy CGI. Hill improvised and influenced key moments, such as the depth of grief over Theodoret's death and the rousing riders of Rohan's speech preparations. His portrayal mixes King Lear like frailty with Henry V esque leadership, making Theoden's redemption arc profoundly moving. The Edora scenes, the ride to Helm's Deep, and battlefield commands showcase Hill's vocal power and physical presence, turning Rohan into a kingdom worth fighting for. Tragically, Hill's later passing only cemented his legacy in these films. Miranda Otto as Eowyn brings strength, vulnerability, and quiet yearning to the Shield Maiden of Rohan. After Uma Thurman turned down the role, later expressing regret, Otto stepped in and delivered a performance that captured Eowyn's warrior spirit and unrequited feelings for Aragorn. Her casting added an Australian intensity that suited the character's resilience. Otto trained in sword fighting and horseback riding for months, performing many of her own action elements. Scenes like her interactions with Aragorn, tending to the wounded, and her subtle defiance against Wormtongue highlight her emotional range. Arwen's arc in the Two Towers, from courtly frustration to battlefield readiness, foreshadows greater heroism, with Otto's nuanced expressions conveying inner turmoil amid the kingdom's peril. Christopher Lee as Saruman continues his menacing presence from the first film. Lee's lifelong affinity for Tolkien and his authoritative voice made him ideal for the fallen wizard. In The Two Towers, Saruman's machinations, breeding Uruk-hai, manipulating Theoden via Wormtongue, and overseeing Isengard's industry gain visual scale. Lee's physical stature and commanding delivery in scenes with Wormtongue or addressing his armies amplify the threat. His casting connected the film to Tolkien's own era, as Lee had met the author and deeply understood the character's corruption by power. Brad Dourif as Grima Wormtongue delivers a slimy, treacherous performance that embodies manipulation and cowardice. Dourif's wide eyes, hunched posture, and whispering delivery make Wormtongue a compelling villain in the Edora's court. His interactions with Theoden and Eowyn drip with insidious intent, building tension before his exile. Dourif's background in intense character roles informed his ability to portray psychological dominance and eventual sniveling retreat. Wormtongue's arc adds layers of political intrigue to Rohan's storyline. David Venom as Faramir introduces a noble yet conflicted Gondorian captain. Venom's thoughtful portrayal contrasts Boromir's rashness, showing Faramir's wisdom and internal struggle with the ring's temptation. His scenes with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum in Osgiliath deepen the ring's corrupting influence while highlighting themes of mercy and duty. Venom's casting brought a quiet intensity that fits Faramir's bookish, honorable nature, making his decision to release the hobbits a pivotal moral choice. Carl Urban as Eomer adds rugged leadership to the Rohirrim. His exile and reunion with Theoden provide momentum to the Rohan defense. Urban's physicality and intense gaze suit the Marshal's warrior ethos, with strong chemistry alongside Hill and Otto. His arrival with the riders at Helm's Deep delivers one of the film's most cathartic moments, supporting players like Bruce Olpress as Aldor, John Bach as Madril, and others in Rohan and Gondor fill out the world with authenticity. The Uruk-hai actors, including Sala Baker, brought ferocity to the antagonists through prosthetics and choreography. Kate Blanchett's Galadriel and Liv Tyler's Arwen appear in visions and flashbacks, maintaining continuity with ethereal grace. Hugo Weaving's Elrond adds gravitas in Rivendell scenes. The ensemble's chemistry was forged through extensive rehearsals, location shoots across New Zealand, and Jackson's collaborative style. Many actors form lifelong bonds, enhancing on screen rapport. Practical effects, motion capture for Gollum, and massive battle sequences demanded physical and emotional endurance, which the cast met with dedication. Mortensen, for instance, endured real injuries and continued performing, mirroring Aragorn's resilience. Casting extended to voice and motion work, with Serkis revolutionizing the field. Treebeard's voice, John Rhys Davies' doubling duties, and end performances required innovative techniques. The Uruk-hai army featured dozens of performers in detailed makeup, creating a believable horde. Smaller roles like the Rohirrim Riders and Helm's Deep Defenders added texture through diverse casting that felt organic to Middle Earth's cultures. Peter Jackson's approach prioritized actors who could inhabit Tolkien's archetypes while adding human depth. Returning cast members provided continuity, while newcomers like Hill, Otto, Venom, and Urban expanded the world seamlessly. Audition processes and offers, such as to Thurman for Eowyn or others for Theoden, reflect careful selection for fit over star power alone, though the final lineup achieved both critical acclaim and commercial success. Performances in key sequences define the film's impact. The Battle of Helm's Deep showcases the cast's stamina in rain soaked night shoots, with Mortensen, Bloom, Rhys Davies, Hill, and Urban leading charges amid explosions and orc onslaughts. The emotional weight of Theoden's healing, Gandalf's return, and the Ents' march on Isengard relies on precise delivery. Frodo and Sam's encounters with Faramir test moral fortitude, while Gollum's scheming adds suspense. These moments succeed because actors fully committed to the physicality, dialects, and emotional arcs required. The casting choices also influenced the trilogy's legacy. They set benchmarks for fantasy adaptations, proving that thoughtful ensemble work could support groundbreaking VFX. Serkis Gollum inspired performance capture in subsequent films. The Rohan actors elevated medieval inspired warfare sequences. Individual contributions, like Hill's practical transformation insistence or Serkis's dual personality mastery, highlighted how casting extends beyond faces to collaborative problem solving. Further depth appears in cultural and linguistic preparation. Actors learned snippets of Elvish, Rohirric inspired accents, and battle cries. Otto's sword training and riding skills transformed Eowyn into a credible shield maiden. Mortensen's immersion in the role included studying Tolkien's appendices and historical warrior archetypes. This dedication ensured authenticity in a story spanning cultures from Hobbit simplicity to elven elegance and human valor. In the intertwined narratives, casting creates parallel emotional journeys. The Hobbit's growth parallels the heroes of Rohan. Gollum's fall warns of the ring's power affecting even the noblest, as seen with Faramir. The ensemble allows seamless cuts between intimate character moments and epic battles, maintaining narrative momentum. Jackson's faith in the cast to handle both quiet despair, Frodo's burden, and rousing leadership, Theoden's speeches, proved essential for a film balancing three major plot threads. Technical aspects amplified performances. Vita workshops, prosthetics for dwarves, orcs, and Uruk-hai let actors emote beneath layers. Motion capture for Gollum preserved circus nuances. Cinematography by Andrew Lesney captured expressive close ups alongside sweeping vistas, giving every performance to shine. Editing wove individual arcs into a cohesive whole, with Howard Shore's score underscoring emotional beats tied to specific actors. The film's success at the box office and awards, nominations for Best Picture, wins for sound and visual effects, validated the casting. Critics praised the ensemble's depth, with particular acclaim for Serkis, Hill, Otto, and the Core Fellowship. Fan reception solidified these actors as definitive portrayals, influencing subsequent Tolkien adaptations and cosplay culture. The cast's reunions and commentaries over the years reveal ongoing camaraderie, a testament to the bonds formed during production. Expanding on individual contributions reveals further nuance. Mortensen's Aragorn in The Two Towers navigates leadership without the full kingship of the third film, allowing exploration of doubt and destiny. His horse riding, sword fights, and quiet moments of reflection add layers. McKellen's Gandalf balances wisdom with action, his staff wielding and strategic counsel pivotal. Wood and Aston's hobbit friendship deepens under duress, with Sam's I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you, foreshadowing future sacrifice. Circus' physical toll in performing Gollum, crawling, climbing, vocal strain, mirrors the character's suffering. Rohan's cast forms a mini ensemble of its own. Hill's Theoden evolves from victim to victor. Otto's Eowyn yearns for purpose. Urban's Eomer embodies loyalty. Durif's Wormtongue sows discord. Their court intrigues and battlefield unity feel lived in thanks to rehearsal time and shared location hardships. Venom's Faramir introduces Gondor's perspective, his mercy contrasting the era's desperation. These additions expanded Tolkien's world without diluting its spirit. Behind the scenes stories enrich the casting narrative. Jackson's persistence in securing rights and funding allowed time for perfect fits. Improvisations like certain Theoden lines or Gollum interactions emerged from actor input. Injuries and weather challenges tested resilience, yet the cast's professionalism prevailed. The result is a film where performances drive the story as much as effects, making The Two Towers a benchmark for epic filmmaking. Further exploration of supporting cast includes the elves at Helm's Deep, led by figures like Haldir, Greg Parker, whose sacrifice adds tragedy. Rohirrim extras and Uruk-hai performers contributed to the scale. Voice actors and stunt doubles extended the principal cast's work. This comprehensive approach ensured every frame felt populated by believable inhabitants of Middle Earth. Thematic resonance stems from casting decisions that emphasize duality and redemption. Gollum's split self, Theoden's healing, Faramir's resistance, Sam's steadfastness. Actors embodied these themes physically and emotionally, making abstract concepts visceral. Jackson's direction encouraged authenticity, fostering performances that resonate decades later. In battle choreography, the cast's training paid off. Helm's deep sequences required coordination among hundreds, with leads performing amid practical rain machines and pyrotechnics. The charge of the Rohirrim at dawn captures collective triumph through individual expressions of relief and fury. Smaller moments like Gimli's complaints or Legolas' feats provide rhythm amid chaos. Character relationships drive much of the emotional core. Aragorn and Eowyn's subtle tension, Gandalf and Théoden's alliance, Frodo and Gollum's uneasy pact, Merry and Pippin's end adventures all thrive due to cast chemistry. These bonds make the film's 3 hour runtime feel intimate despite its scope. Ultimately, the casting of The Two Towers exemplifies how selecting the right performers, talented, committed, and synergistic, can transform a literary adaptation into a cultural touchstone. Each actor's contribution, from leads to supporting roles, weaves into a tapestry that honors Tolkien while standing as a cinematic achievement in its own right. The ensemble's work ensures the film remains compelling on repeated viewings, with new nuances emerging in performances that capture hope amid encroaching darkness. The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers 2002 production and release, production development and pre-production, when New Line Cinema greenlit Peter Jackson's adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings in 1998. The decision that shaped everything that followed was already unusual by Hollywood standards. Rather than making one film, then deciding whether to greenlight a sequel based on box office performance, The studio committed to shooting all three volumes of Tolkien's story back to back as a single continuous production. This meant that The Two Towers, the middle chapter, was never really developed on its own. Its screenplay, castings, sets, and effects work were conceived from the outset as part of one immense undertaking that would eventually yield the Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. The screenplay for The Two Towers was credited to Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, Steven Sinclair, and Jackson himself, the same core team, minus Sinclair, who contributed to the second film, specifically responsible for shaping Tolkien's dense, multi threaded prose into something that could function as cinema. Adapting the second volume of the novel presented a distinct structural problem that the first film had not faced. Tolkien's The Two Towers is itself split into two books that follow entirely separate groups of characters without ever intersecting. Book 3 follows Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the fate of Merry, Pippin, and the forces of Rohan, while Book IV follows only Frodo, Sam, and Gollum on their journey toward Mordor. Reading them sequentially works on the page, but Jackson and his writers judged that presenting 90 minutes of one storyline followed by 90 minutes of a completely different one would kill the momentum of a film. Their solution was to interweave the three narrative strands: Frodo and Sam's trek with Gollum, Aragorn's group trekking the orc captured hobbits into Rohan, and Merry and Pippin's escape into Fangorn Forest, cutting between them throughout the runtime, a structure that became one of the defining formal characteristics of the finished film. The decision to shoot all three films simultaneously was itself a significant gamble on New Line Cinema's part, one that shaped every subsequent choice made about the Two Towers specifically. Financing a production of this scope required the studio to commit a combined budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars before a single frame of the first film had been shown to a paying audience, an arrangement almost unheard of at the time for a fantasy property without an established track record on screen. That financing structure meant that pre production planning for the Two Towers, its set, its new characters, its effects requirements, proceeded in parallel with, rather than after, the finishing and release of Fellowship of the Ring, so that by the time the first film opened in December 2001 to strong reviews and box office numbers, much of the physical and digital groundwork for the second and third films was already well underway or complete. This arrangement gave Jackson and his collaborators an unusual degree of creative continuity. Actors, department heads, and design teams did not have to be reassembled or rebriefed between films, and creative decisions made for the Two Towers, casting, set design, effects methodology could draw directly on lessons already learned during the shoot of the first installment rather than starting over. The writing process itself was collaborative and iterative, built around regular story sessions in which Jackson, Walsh, Boyens, and for the second film, Sinclair worked through successive drafts of the script together, testing structural choices against the practical realities of what could be filmed and against their own sense of what worked dramatically once the story had been pulled out of Tolkien's prose and put into a visual, scene based format. This restructuring required the writers to invent or substantially expand material that either did not exist in the book or existed only in summary form. Some of the most significant departures from Tolkien's text trace directly back to this pre production writing process. The character of Faramir, who in the novel is one of the few individuals shown to be entirely unmoved by the temptation of the One Ring, was rewritten so that he initially attempts to bring Frodo and the ring to his father in Gondor, introducing a dramatic temptation arc that mirrors his brother Boromir's fall in the first film. The screenwriters felt that a character who simply refused the ring's temptation without any visible struggle would undercut the power of the ring as the film's central object of dread, and this change became one of the most debated adjustments among longtime readers of the book once the film reached audiences. Similarly, The confrontation at Helm's Deep was expanded considerably beyond its scope in the source material, and new material was written involving Arwen, a character whose role in the film trilogy was substantially enlarged relative to the appendices level presence she has in Tolkien's original text, in part to strengthen a romantic through line and give Liv Tyler's character more to do across the three films. Casting had already been locked in during preparation for the first film, since all three movies were being shot as one continuous production. But the pre production period specific to The Two Towers saw the arrival of several major new characters who had not appeared in Fellowship. Bernard Hill was cast as King Theoden of Rohan, a role demanding an arc from a man rendered Saruman's influence to a king restored to vigor and command. Miranda Otto joined as Eowyn, Carl Urban as Eomer, David Wenham as Faramir, and Brad Dourif as the treacherous counselor Grima Wormtongue. Christopher Lee, who had already appeared as Saruman in the first film, continued in the role, bringing to it his own encyclopedic familiarity with Tolkien's writing. Lee had read the novel annually since its publication and was known on set for correcting minor points of lore. Perhaps the most consequential piece of pre production casting, however, was the choice to bring in Andy Serkis to perform Gollum. Serkis had originally been engaged simply to provide a reference, voice, and physical performance that the animation team at Veta Digital could study while building a computer generated character. But as work progressed, it became clear that his performance was so central to making Gollum convincing that the production restructured its approach to accommodate him as a true on-set acting partner for Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, rather than a voice actor working in isolation after the fact. The role of Aragorn had famously within fan circles almost gone to a different actor altogether. Reports from the period indicate that Nicolas Cage had at one point been considered for the part but was ultimately unavailable due to family commitments, clearing the way for Viggo Mortensen, who had joined the production relatively late during the shoot of the first film, and by the time of The Two Towers was fully embedded in the physically demanding requirements of the role, including extensive sword work choreographed under the guidance of the Olympic level fencer Bob Anderson, who worked with the cast on the trilogy's various combat sequences. Casting director Liz Mullane, who had shaped the ensemble since the earliest stages of the trilogy's preparation, continued to oversee the addition of supporting performers and background talent needed for Rohan's court, its army, and the refugee columns fleeing toward Helm's Deep. Cast members who joined this stage of the production have since described a set culture that, despite the enormous pressures of schedule and scale, remained notably collegial. Miranda Otto, arriving for her first day of filming as Eowyn, has recalled being welcomed warmly by Liv Tyler, who told her she was glad to have another woman in the cast, a small but telling detail of how a production this large still functioned day to day as a group of colleagues getting to know one another under extraordinary working conditions. The sheer scale of what needed to be designed and built before cameras could roll on. The Two Towers specific material was staggering. Weta Workshop, the effects and design house, co founded by Richard Taylor, had already built extensive amounts of armor, weaponry, and prosthetics for the first film, but the middle installment demanded new environments on a larger scale. The fortress of Helm's Deep, the ruined Tower of Orthanc, and the industrialized war machine of Isengard beneath it, the Golden Hall of Medicelt in Edoras, and the sprawling, half living forest of Fangorn, home to the Ents. Conceptual work on these environments had been underway since the mid to late 1990s, led by illustrators Alan Lee and John Howe, whose paintings had informed Tolkien fandom for decades before Jackson brought them onto the production as the trilogy's primary conceptual designers. Lee and Howe worked alongside Witter Workshop's in house design and construction departments, translating illustrated concepts into buildable sets, sculpted maquettes, and eventually full scale or miniature builds, a pipeline that had already been tested extensively during preparation for Fellowship of the Ring and that carried over directly into the design of Rohan's culture, Edoras's Golden Hall of Meduseld and the Fortress of Helm's Deep for the second film. Because the three films were being designed together rather than sequentially, decisions about the visual identity of Rohan and Isengard were made with an eye toward how those cultures would need to look and function not only in the Two Towers but in the subsequent film as well, allowing sets, costumes, and props built during this pre production period to be reused or extended for later material rather than rebuilt from scratch. The pre production period also required extensive planning for the physical logistics of a shoot that would ultimately span both of New Zealand's main islands and dozens of individual locations. Unit bases, equipment transport, accommodation for a very large cast and crew, and coordination with the New Zealand Defence Force, whose personnel were engaged to help fill out the ranks of the film's armies, all had to be organized well in advance of any of the specific two tower sequences actually being filmed. This scale of logistical planning, unusual for a New Zealand based production at the time, was itself part of what made the trilogy a significant moment for the country's film industry, establishing infrastructure, crew expertise, and a level of international visibility for New Zealand's production capabilities that outlasted the trilogy's own release and shaped the country's screen industry for years afterward. Filming, because all three films were shot as a single production, there is no clean separation between filming the first movie and filming the second. Principal photography for the entire trilogy began in New Zealand in October 1999 and continued with the cast and crew working in overlapping blocks across multiple units until December 2000, followed by an extensive period of additional photography, commonly called pickups, that stretched intermittently from 2001 into 2004 as reshoots, newly written scenes, and effects driven material were captured. Jackson directed principal photography himself while overseeing three additional units, allowing multiple sequences to be filmed concurrently across New Zealand's North and South Islands, an arrangement that was itself a significant logistical experiment for a production of this size. Across the material specific to the two towers, the production drew on more than 20 confirmed New Zealand filming locations, with particularly heavy use made of the volcanic Tongariro region in the central North Island, which supplied the visual basis for Mordor and the wilds of Ithilien, and the tussock covered high country of Otago in the South Island, which became the on screen home of Rohan. Running multiple units concurrently allowed Jackson's core creative team, together with additional directors and cinematographers handling second unit photography, to keep several of the film's storylines moving forward on location at the same time, a necessity given how much material needed to be captured across a shooting period stretching well beyond what a single unit could have managed within the overall trilogy schedule. New Zealand's varied landscape stood in for nearly every region Tolkien described. The volcanic terrain around Mount Ruapehu and the Tongariro region in the North Island, already established in the first film as the visual basis for the volcanic wastes near Mordor, was used again for the sequences of Frodo, Sam, and Gollum crossing Imminmuil and moving through Ithilien, with the crags of the Wakapapa ski field standing in for the rocky terrain the hobbits scramble across after capturing Gollum, and the Tukino ski field used for exterior shots near the Black Gate. The eerie sequence in which Frodo and Sam cross the dead marshes, wading past the drowned faces of ancient warriors, was filmed at the Kepler Mire, a large peat bog near Te Anau in the South Island, chosen for its flat, waterlogged expanse and its unsettling, otherworldly stillness. The storyline following Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and later the Rohirrim, drew heavily on the high country of Otago in New Zealand's South Island. The rolling, tussock covered hills around Queenstown supplied the visual identity of Rohan itself. Deer Park Heights, overlooking Lake Wakatipu, was used for the sequence in which the refugees of Edoras flee toward Helm's Deep, while the Ida Valley area near Alexandra was used for scenes depicting a Rohan village under attack by Saruman's raiders. Isengard, Saruman's fortress, drew on the dramatic scenery around Glenorchy at the head of Lake Wakatipu, a location whose real beauty was digitally transformed in post production into the blasted, deforested industrial landscape the story required. The film's largest and most demanding physical set piece by far was the Battle of Helm's Deep, often called the Battle of the Hornburg, which occupies the climactic third of the film. The set, the deeping wall, the fortress of the Hornburg, and the surrounding causeway was constructed inside Dry Creek Quarry near Upper Hutt, close to Wellington, a working quarry whose enclosed, controllable geography made it well suited to a massive night shoot. Filming the battle required 120 consecutive nights of exterior photography, an undertaking that crew members involved in the production have since described as one of the most punishing shoots in the trilogy. Much of the sequence was filmed under artificial rain towers to preserve visual continuity with the story's depiction of a storm breaking over the battle, meaning that cast and crew were regularly soaked through for hours at a stretch across weeks of overnight work in cold South Island conditions. Cast members have recalled the physical toll of walking and fighting across the quarry's uneven, rock strewn ground night after night, a set so relentlessly littered with stone that it became something of a running joke on set. More than 20 hours of footage were eventually shot for the sequence, all of it eventually cut down to roughly 10 minutes of finished battle in the theatrical version. To populate the battle with the thousands of combatants the story demanded, the production relied on a mixture of methods. Extras, stunt performers, and members of the New Zealand Defence Force who had been recruited to fill out the ranks of Rohan's defenders and Saruman's Uruk-hai army handled foreground and mid-ground action, but a battle on the scale the script called for, with armies numbering in the thousands clashing across a fortress wall, was well beyond what live performers alone could achieve. To solve this, Veta Digital developed a proprietary crowd simulation software system called Massive, which allowed individual computer generated soldiers, referred to internally as agents, to be given a form of independent artificial intelligence, reacting to nearby combatants, terrain, and battlefield events rather than following identical scripted animation cycles. This gave the resulting digital armies a sense of chaotic, believable individuality that had not previously been achieved at this scale in a feature film, and the massive system, along with an associated rendering tool called Grunt, was used extensively not only for Helm's Deep but for the film's other large scale combat sequences. Voice work for the Uruk-hai and other Orc forces drew on an unusual source. Sound designers recorded Maori haka performances to build the guttural, rhythmic bass layer used for the intimidating chants and war cries the Uruk-hai deliver before their assault on the fortress, grounding the film's fantasy violence in a distinctly New Zealand vocal tradition. Beyond Helm's Deep, the Rohan storyline required its own extensive stunt and second unit work, much of it built around horseback action. Viggo Mortensen's Aragorn is swept away in a river during an ambush by Warg Riders partway through the film, presumed dead by his companions before being found alive by his horse, Brego, a sequence that combined location photography along South Island rivers with underwater and stunt work coordinated separately from the main unit's battle photography. The refugee column fleeing Edoras for Helm's Deep, along with the subsequent Warg attack, was staged across several of the Otago locations already scouted for Rohan, using large numbers of horses, extras, and stunt riders working in tandem with the production's separate stunt coordination team. Period reporting on the production noted that dozens of dead horse props, built from polystyrene rather than any practical animal effect, had to be fabricated for the aftermath of these battle sequences, a small but labor intensive example of the physical prop building demanded by a production operating at this scale. Individual continuity details from the battle sequences were also treated with care by the production. One extra who appeared in a close up during the Helm's Deep battle had a missing eye and initially arrived on set wearing a prosthetic patch and was invited by Jackson to appear in the finished shot without it. An experience the performer later said left him more comfortable with his own appearance. Alongside the battle, one of the production's most technically demanding and closely scrutinized achievements was the creation of Gollum as a fully computer generated character who nonetheless had to share the screen convincingly with human actors and carry substantial emotional weight, including an extended, largely solo sequence in which Gollum's two personalities, the submissive Smeagol and the possessive, cruel Gollum, argue with one another. Andy Serkis performed the role physically on set alongside Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, typically wearing a plain, close fitting grey suit so that the other actors had something to react to, and so that Jackson could direct scene as a genuine three-way performance rather than shooting the hobbits reacting to an empty space to be filled in digitally later. Separately, Weta Digital built a motion capture volume where additional body performance data from Serkis wearing a suit fitted with optical tracking markers was recorded and used by animators as reference. The final on screen character was not a direct, unmodified transposition of this captured data. Instead, a team of animators, closely observing Serkis's original performance, hand animated Gollum's face and body using the motion capture information as a guide rather than a finished product. Weta's creature and facial teams, including artists responsible for building the underlying facial puppet that animators used to pose Gollum's expressions, spent roughly 3 years developing the character across the Tridi's production. Additional technical work went into simulating Gollum's hair and the physical behavior of his emaciated, sinewy body using cloth and dynamic simulation tools that Weta continued to refine for the character across the subsequent film. Alongside Gollum, the Fangorn Forest storyline required the production to solve a very different design problem: how to bring to life Treebeard, the ancient tree like ent who befriends Merry and Pippin, at a scale described in Tolkien's writing as somewhere in the region of 14 feet tall that made straightforward practical performance impossible. Weta's early approach was to build a full size animatronic puppet representing Treebeard's upper torso, on which the actors playing Merry and Pippin could actually sit and interact during filming, giving them a tangible physical presence to perform against on set. Jackson liked the deliberate, almost stop motion quality of the puppet's movement and aesthetic quality that the effects team consciously chose to preserve when the character was ultimately completed as a digital creation, rather than smoothing it into more conventionally lifelike motion. Animation supervisors have cited the stop motion work of Ray Harryhausen as a touchstone for the rigid, deliberate way Treebeard was made to move and speak once fully rendered. Treebeard's voice was provided by John Rhys Davies, who also played the dwarf Gimli in the same film, achieved by having the actor speak in the lowest natural register he could produce, further processed and deepened, with some period accounts noting he recorded lines through a megaphone like device to help shape the character's slow, resonant, distinctly non human cadence, an intentional contrast to the urgency of the human and hobbit dialogue happening elsewhere in the story at the same time. The character's design and the enormous computational cost of the film's other digital work meant that individual complex shots, particularly those built around Gollum, could take many hours of computer rendering time per shot, with some of the most demanding images left processing on Weta's render farm overnight before artists could review the results the following day. Post production editing on the trilogy was, like photography, organized around the simultaneous nature of the production rather than treated as three discrete post production schedules. Daily rushes were reviewed continuously from 1999 through 2002, with assembly cuts of each film running to roughly 4.5 hours before editors, and Jackson began the long process of shaping them down toward releasable length. The Two Towers was edited primarily by Michael J. Horton and Jabez Olsen, and crew members involved in the trilogy's production have generally agreed that it was the most difficult of the three films to cut, precisely because of the structural issue that had shaped its screenplay from the beginning. Unlike Fellowship, which has a clear point of departure, and Return of the King, which has a clear resolution, The Two Towers begins and ends in the middle of ongoing action without a natural narrative frame, forcing editors to work harder to give the film a satisfying shape despite picking up and putting down three separate storylines throughout. This editorial challenge was compounded by the sheer volume of footage generated for the Helm's Deep sequence alone, which had to be distilled from many hours of raw material into a battle that could be followed clearly by an audience while still conveying the scale and desperation the story called for. Editors involved in the process have described the compression of that single sequence as itself a months long undertaking layered on top of the ordinary demands of assembling the rest of the film. The editing process was also where much of the film's final narrative shape, as distinct from its shooting script, was actually determined. Jackson has spoken of picking apart individual scenes on a near daily basis during this stage of the process, weighing multiple takes and alternate readings of dialogue against one another, and in a number of cases, concluding that material that had read well on the page or played adequately during filming was ultimately redundant once assembled alongside the surrounding footage and could therefore be trimmed or removed entirely without weakening the finished film because The Two Towers was being cut against the backdrop of the already released Fellowship of the Ring. Its editors also had the comparatively unusual benefit of being able to gauge some early audience and critical reaction to the trilogy's tone and pacing before finalizing decisions about the second film, informing choices about how much time to devote to character driven material such as the growing relationship between Theoden and his court, or the introspective scenes involving Gollum and Smeagol's split personality relative to the film's numerous large scale action sequences. Visual effects work was overseen by a team that included Jim Rigiel, Joe Lettery, Randall William Cook, and Alex Funke. Coordinating work spread across Weta Digital and Weta Workshop as well as additional houses. By the time of the film's release, the effects team had composited more than 900 individual visual effect shots into the finished picture, a workload that had grown substantially from what the first film required as the story moved further into large scale battle and creature material. Beyond the massive crowd simulations and Gollum's character animation, the effects team relied heavily on miniature work integrated with digital compositing. Large sections of Helm's Deep, for instance, were also built as scale miniatures at two different sizes, one built to roughly a quarter scale and a second, more detailed version built much smaller for wide establishing shots, filmed separately using motion control cameras and combined with live action plates and computer generated elements using digital compositing software, including Apple's Shake, which the effects team used extensively to merge these varied sources of imagery into single seamless shots. This combination of techniques allowed Jackson to achieve camera moves, sweeping low over the battlefield or pushing in rapidly on the fortress that would have been impractical or prohibitively expensive to achieve with a full scale set and crane mounted cameras alone. And effects supervisors involved in the work later noted that the projection technique developed for these sequences also produced significant cost savings since it avoided the expense of bringing the full cast and crew back to reshoot plates against the physical set once a shot needed to be revised or extended. Sound post production involved an extensive team responsible for both the design of the film's battle and creature effects and the finest mix, work that would later be recognized with major industry awards. Building a plausible sonic identity for Gollum, the Uruk-hai, and the Ents required extensive experimentation. Vocal work for Gollum built on and extended Andy Serkis's own vocal performance, layering it with subtle processing rather than replacing it outright, while the low, resonant quality of Treebeard's voice and the massed sound of thousands of orcs marching, chanting, and fighting at Helm's Deep required combining recorded human performance with library and newly recorded effects work to create a soundscape convincing at a scale no single recording session could realistically capture. Because the trilogy was shot as a continuous production, sound editors and mixers, much like the visual effects teams, were able to develop and refine techniques across the making of Fellowship that could then be applied and extended for the Two Towers, rather than developing an entirely new sonic vocabulary for the sequel from scratch. Costume, makeup, and prosthetic work carried over from the design language established in the first film, continuing the collaboration between costume designer Gila Dixon and Veta Workshop's prosthetics and armor departments, whose combined efforts on the trilogy would also be honored by industry bodies. The introduction of the Rohirrim as a fully realized on screen culture in the Two Towers required an entirely new visual vocabulary distinct from what had already been established for hobbits, elves, and the Men of Gondor in the first film. Costume and armor design for Rohan drew on an early medieval Anglo Saxon inflected aesthetic worked out through the same collaborative design process led by illustrators Alan Lee and John Howe, together with Veta Workshop, that had shaped every other culture in the trilogy's version of Middle Earth. Prosthetic and makeup work also expanded substantially for this installment to accommodate Theoden's transformation from a wizened, Saruman possessed figure into a restored and vigorous king. A physical before and after achieved largely through practical makeup applied to Bernard Hill rather than digital alteration, in keeping with the production's general preference for practical in camera solutions wherever they were achievable within the schedule. Music, the score for the Two Towers was composed, orchestrated, and conducted by Howard Shore, continuing the thematic architecture he had established for Fellowship of the Ring while introducing a substantial body of new material tied to the settings and characters introduced in the second film. Shaw's work was performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra with vocal contributions from the London Voices Choir and the London Oratory School Shola, whose boys' voices had already become associated with several of the trilogy's recurring themes. Structurally, the score expanded Shaw's system of leitmotifs, musical themes tied to specific peoples, places, and ideas within Middle Earth. Rohan was given a distinctive theme rooted in a Norwegian folk fiddle sound, performed by soloist Dermot Crehan on the Hardanger fiddle, lending the culture of the horse lords and earthy, folk inflected character distinct from the more orchestral themes associated with elves or men of Gondor. New action material was composed for the film's large scale set pieces, including cues built around the ride of the Rohirrim, the defense of Helm's Deep, and the unleashing of Saruman's army from Isengard, several of which are woven together into an extended sequence of sustained orchestral and choral intensity toward the film's climax. Thematic material associated with Gollum recurs throughout in fragmented, unsettling form, freakish choral writing and disorienting brass color mark his introduction and his passages through the Dead Marshes, before being drawn together in the film's best known standalone vocal piece. That piece, Gollum's song, plays over the closing credits and was written with lyrics by Fran Walsh, one of the film's screenwriters and Jackson's wife, set to music derived from Shaw's Gollum associated material. Shaw and Jackson originally hoped to have the song performed by the Icelandic singer Björk, whose unconventional vocal style they felt matched Gollum's fractured alien personality, but she declined the offer due to her pregnancy at the time. The producers turned instead to Emiliana Torini, another Icelandic born vocalist whose performance of the piece was singled out by numerous critics and soundtrack reviewers as one of the emotional high points of the film's musical presentation. The song and Shore's score as a whole received significant industry recognition, including a Grammy Award for the composer's work on the film. Recording sessions for the score took place in London, drawing on the city's deep pool of orchestral and choral talent that Shaw had already worked with extensively on the first film, and the sessions became something of a cultural touchstone for fans of the trilogy in their own right. Period documentation of the sessions, including photography taken near the studios where the recordings were made, became a recognizable part of how the soundtrack was later marketed and discussed. Shaw's method across the trilogy involved assigning distinct musical material to essentially every people, culture, and significant object within the story, then developing, combining, and transforming those themes as the narrative required, an approach that gave the Two Towers, despite following directly on from a score already rich with established motifs, its own clearly identifiable musical identity built around the new material for Rohan, Isengard, and Gollum introduced in this installment. The official soundtrack album, released on Reprise Records in December 2002, ran to just over 72 minutes across 20 tracks in its standard edition, with a limited edition adding a further bonus track. In addition to Gollum's song, the album featured vocal contributions from Isabel Bayraktaryan on the piece Even Star, Sheila Chandra on Breath of Life, and Elizabeth Fraser, formerly of the Cocteau Twins, alongside boy soprano Ben Del Maestro on Isengard Unleashed, giving the album a texture that mixed full orchestral writing with distinctive individual voices in a way that had also characterized the soundtrack to the first film. As with Fellowship, the commercial soundtrack represented only a portion of the music actually composed and recorded for the film. A more complete presentation of Shaw's score for the Two Towers was issued years later as part of an expanded complete recordings release, giving listeners and film music specialists access to substantially more of Shaw's material than the roughly 70-minute commercial album had been able to accommodate, including cues written for scenes that were trimmed or restructured during editing and therefore never appeared in their originally composed form in the finished film. Critics and specialist film music reviewers who covered the soundtrack on its original release were largely positive, praising in particular the way Shaw's new material for Rohan and for Gollum integrated with the thematic architecture already established in the first film's score, so that the two soundtracks, despite being written and recorded across different sessions, felt like continuous installments of a single larger musical work rather than two unrelated scores sharing a franchise name. The choral and orchestral forces assembled for the recordings, combining the London Philharmonic Orchestra with multicoting array of featured solo vocalists across the various tracks, were frequently cited as giving the score a scale and sonic richness in keeping with the visual scope of the film itself, reinforcing the sense that music, like the visual effects and production design, had been treated as a first order storytelling tool throughout the trilogy rather than as a secondary or purely supportive element of the filmmaking release theatrical The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers had its premiere at the Ziegfeld Theatre in New York City on the 5th December 2002, ahead of its wider release. The film opened in the United States on 18th December 2002 and in Jackson's home country of New Zealand the following day, 19th December, with staggered openings across dozens of other territories through the same week, a rollout pattern typical of major studio tentpoles, positioned for the lucrative pre Christmas and holiday movie-going period. New Line Cinema distributed the film worldwide, opening it on three 622 screens in the United States, a slightly wider release than the 3,359 theaters Fellowship of the Ring had opened on the previous December. The film's debut was treated by the studio and by trade press as a major test of whether the goodwill generated by the first installment could be sustained and grown for a middle chapter, a type of film that traditionally faced more skepticism from both audiences and industry observers than a franchise's opening entry. The results were emphatic. On its first day, a Wednesday, the film took in an estimated $26 million domestically and a further $16 million internationally, for a worldwide single day total of roughly $42 million, an increase of close to 45% over the equivalent one day gross achieved by Fellowship of the Ring a year earlier. It ranked as the second highest Wednesday opening in box office history to that point, trailing only Star Wars, Episode I, The Phantom Menace. Midnight showings on the preceding Tuesday night sold out across the country, with fans lining up outside theaters well before the film's first screenings, a pattern of anticipatory fan enthusiasm that had already become closely associated with the franchise. Over its full opening weekend, the film earned approximately 61.5 to $62 million domestically, with a cumulative 5 day total from Wednesday through Sunday of around $102 million in North America alone, an increase of roughly 30 to 35% over Fellowship's equivalent debut the year before. It played on an average of nearly $17,000 per theater across its opening weekend, a notably strong figure for a release of this width. Internationally, the film opened across some 25 territories in its first days, taking in close to $88 million in its first 5 days abroad, a launch that New Line's own distribution executives noted was some 38% stronger than Fellowship's international opening had been. Individual territories saw the film break records outright. It set new opening day and opening weekend marks in Denmark and posted record openings in Germany, Switzerland, and several other European markets, while also opening strongly in the United Kingdom and Ireland, France, Spain, South Korea, and Mexico, among other countries. Combining domestic and international grosses, the film's worldwide total after only 5 days in release stood at roughly $190 million, prompting New Line's head of worldwide marketing and distribution to predict publicly that the Two Towers would ultimately surpass the $860 million global total achieved by Fellowship of the Ring, and by a considerable margin beyond the headline figures. Trade reporting on the international rollout captured just how broadly the film's success was distributed across individual markets rather than being concentrated in one or two large territories. The United Kingdom and Ireland alone produced an opening haul in the region of $21 million from just over 1,000 screens, while France, Spain, South Korea, Sweden, Mexico, and Norway each posted openings in the low millions of dollars, figures that, taken together with the record setting results in Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland, suggested a genuinely global audience for the film rather than one driven primarily by North American demand. New Line's distribution leadership framed this breadth of performance explicitly as evidence that the franchise had become what the studio's own marketing language of the time described as a worldwide phenomenon, a characterization that box office analysts covering the industry largely agreed with, given how consistently the film outperformed its predecessor across almost every individual market where comparable data existed. The film continued to perform strongly through the remainder of December and into early 2003, benefiting from the extended holiday movie-going window and from largely positive word of mouth building on already enthusiastic reviews. It was the number one film at the North American box office across multiple consecutive weekly charting periods through the end of December 2002 and into January 2003, holding off a crowded field of other award season and holiday releases, including a number of high profile studio pictures that had been positioned to compete directly for the same holiday audience. Trade coverage of the period noted that The Two Towers was unusual among holiday tentpoles in maintaining such a commanding lead through multiple consecutive frames rather than ceding the top spot to newer entries as the holiday season wore on, a pattern that reflected both the strength of the film itself and the scale of pent up anticipation that had built up in the year, separating it from Fellowship of the Ring. Home media The Two Towers followed a home media release pattern that had already been established with Fellowship of the Ring and would be repeated again for Return of the King. An initial theatrical cut DVD release followed roughly a year later by a far more elaborate extended edition release containing additional footage and hours of supplementary material. The theatrical version of The Two Towers was released on DVD in August 2003. Later that same year, in November 2003, New Line issued the special extended edition, marketed under its Platinum Series branding, as a 4 disc set. 2 discs contain the extended cut of the film itself, incorporating more than 40 minutes of material not shown in the theatrical release, while the remaining 2 discs were devoted to bonus content, including several hours of behind the scenes documentaries covering stunt work, production design, the New Zealand locations, and of particular interest to audiences given the character's high profile, an extensive account of the creation of Gollum. The set also included multiple audio commentary tracks in which cast members, department heads, and Jackson himself discussed the making of the film, along with design galleries, sketches, and a DVD ROM component offering additional online linked content. Features considered unusually comprehensive for a home video release at the time and widely praised by critics covering the DVD market specifically. The extended cut runs to 223 minutes compared with the theatrical version's 179-minute running time. Reviewers covering the DVD market at the time of the extended edition's release were generally enthusiastic about its scope, noting that the roughly 6.5 hours of accompanying documentary material offered an unusually thorough account of the production, touching on stunt work, production design, the New Zealand locations used across the shoot, and in particular the extended process by which Veta Digital's team built Gollum, a subject that had generated intense curiosity among audiences and critics alike following the character's reception in theaters. The set's design galleries, commentary tracks featuring cast and department heads discussing individual scenes and decisions, and its DVD ROM component with additional linked content were seen as setting a high bar for the special edition home video format more broadly during the early 2000s, when supplementary bonus content was becoming an increasingly important part of how studios marketed catalog and franchise releases on physical media. Both versions were later reissued in high definition formats. The theatrical cut arrived on Blu ray in September 2010, generally as part of a boxed set alongside the theatrical editions of the other two films, while the extended edition followed on Blu ray in June 2011, again typically packaged together with the extended cuts of Fellowship of the Ring and Return of the King. The film has subsequently been made available in numerous further home video and digital formats, including 4K Ultra HD releases pairing the theatrical and extended versions of the trilogy, ensuring that both cuts of The Two Towers have remained continuously available to home audiences across each successive generation of video format since the film's original theatrical run. Reception box office The Two Towers was, by any conventional measure, a major commercial success, and it substantially outperformed even the very high expectations set by its predecessor. Produced on a budget reported at roughly $94 million, consistent with the overall financing structure covering all three films shot together, the film went on to gross approximately $342 million in North America and a further $606 million in other territories for a worldwide total in the neighborhood of $926 to $948 million, with slightly different figures reported by different tracking services depending on methodology and the point at which the film's theatrical run was considered closed. Box Office Mojo, for instance, lists a worldwide theatrical total of approximately $923 million against a $62 million opening weekend and a widest release of 3,622 theaters, while other outlets have cited totals closer to 926 or $948 million. Such modest discrepancies are common for films with long theatrical tails and staggered international rollouts spanning many months. Whatever the precise final figure, the result placed The Two Towers comfortably among the highest grossing films of 2002 and at the time among the highest grossing films ever released, later cited as sitting around the 24th spot on all time worldwide rankings once adjusted for the period in question. Within its own franchise, the film's financial performance also set it apart in a specific way. While Fellowship of the Ring had needed to build an audience for a genre and a source text that studios had historically regarded as commercially risky, and Return of the King would benefit from 3 years of accumulated audience investment and the natural pull of a trilogy's concluding chapter. The Two Towers had to prove that audience enthusiasm could be sustained and even grown for a film that by definition could offer no true resolution. Its ability to outgross its predecessor by a comfortable margin was accordingly treated by industry analysts less as a simple box office data point and more as validation of New Line's entire financing model for the trilogy, since a soft sophomore performance could have jeopardized confidence in the concluding installment, even though Return of the King had by that point already been shot in its entirety. It represented a clear increase over Fellowship of the Ring's worldwide total of roughly 884 to $887 million, validating New Line's decision to finance and shoot the entire trilogy as a single, continuous, extraordinarily expensive bet before knowing definitively how audiences would respond to the first installment. The film's performance also fed directly into anticipation for the trilogy's conclusion the following year. Industry commentary at the time noted that if the momentum of The Two Towers' launch held, the franchise stood a real chance of joining a franchise extremely small group of films that had crossed the $1 billion worldwide mark, a threshold that Return of the King would in fact reach a year later. The film's box office trajectory after its opening weekend was itself notable for how well it held up over the following weeks, a pattern often taken by industry observers as a sign of strong word of mouth rather than a burst of opening weekend curiosity that quickly fades. Weekly domestic box office tracking through the North American holiday period shows the film continuing to dominate the overall chart week after week through the Christmas and New Year period, with the film's share of the weekly box office actually growing during the final week of December as the holiday season brought larger numbers of moviegoers into theaters generally, and the Two Towers captured an outsized portion of that growth relative to its competitors. It remained the number one film domestically for multiple consecutive weeks running into January 2003, fending off a crowded roster of other high profile award season and holiday titles released around the same time, including major studio competitors that had been expected to contest the top of the chart during the same window. Critical response to Two Towers was met with critical acclaim on release, and in the view of many critics writing at the time and in retrospective assessments since, it was received at least as warmly as Fellowship of the Ring, with a number of reviewers arguing that Jackson had solved the classic middle chapter problem. The difficulty of making a film that has neither a true beginning nor a true end feels satisfying in its own right, more successfully than might have been expected. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating in the mid 90s% range across several hundred collected reviews, with the site's critical consensus describing the film as balancing spectacular action with emotional storytelling in a way that leaves audiences satisfied while still eager for the trilogy's final chapter. On Metacritic, which aggregates critic scores on a weighted numerical scale. The film scored in the high 80s, a rating the service itself characterizes as indicating universal acclaim based on several dozen reviews. Audiences responding to CinemaScore exit polling gave the film a strongly positive average grade as well, indicating that critical enthusiasm was matched by the reaction of general movie-going audiences rather than diverging from it. Individual reviews at the time of release tended to single out several recurring elements for praise. Roger Ebert, writing for the Chicago Sun-Times, described the film as a rousing adventure built on a skillful marriage of practical effects, computer animation, and moments of genuine visual beauty, and singled out the character of Gollum as one of the most convincing and engaging computer generated creations he had encountered in a film to that point. Ebert did note, as he and other critics did, that the film took real liberties with Tolkien's text and, in his assessment, sacrificed some of the whimsy and gentleness that characterized passages of the novel in favor of a darker, more action driven tone. But he judged that the film succeeded as a work of visionary popular filmmaking on its own terms, even where it diverged from strict fidelity to the source material. Other reviewers, writing for outlets ranging from major daily newspapers to specialist genre press, praised the film's technical achievement in weaving together three simultaneous storylines without the film losing coherence, its handling of large scale battle choreography, and the emotional depth brought to newly introduced characters such as Theoden and Gollum, despite the film already being deep into a long, complicated narrative when they are introduced. Andy Serkis' performance as Gollum drew particularly sustained attention and was frequently cited by critics as a highlight of the film. Credit both to Serkis' own acting choices and to the technical work of the Weta animation team who translated that performance into a fully realized digital character. Several critics and industry commentators at the time argued that the achievement blurred conventional distinctions between live performance and animation in ways that had not previously been demonstrated so convincingly on screen. The extended sequence in which Gollum and Smeagol argue with each other, cutting between the characters' two competing personalities through carefully matched editing rather than any obvious trickery, was singled out repeatedly as a technical and dramatic high point of the film, with reviewers noting that the scene worked because of the emotional coherence of Serkis's performance as much as because of the sophistication of the underlying visual effects work, and that neither element alone would have carried the scene as effectively as the two did in combination. This sequence and the character's performance more broadly also fed into broader critical and industry conversation during the period about how awards bodies and the acting branch of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences specifically ought to treat performances that combined live acting with substantial digital transformation. A conversation Serkis's Gollum did much to popularize, even though the performance itself did not receive a competitive acting nomination from the Academy that year. Beyond Gollum, critics also devoted considerable attention to the newly introduced human characters and the actors playing them. Bernard Hill's performance as Theoden was frequently praised for conveying, through voice and physical bearing alone, before any makeup or visual transformation took hold, the sense of a once formidable king who had been hollowed out by Saruman's influence, and then for charting his gradual return to strength and command once Gandalf frees him from that influence, an arc several reviewers considered one of the more emotionally satisfying threads running through a film otherwise dominated by spectacle. Miranda Otto's Eowyn and David Wenham's Faramir also drew positive notice, even from critics who were otherwise unhappy with the specific narrative choices made regarding Faramir's temptation by the ring, on the grounds that both actors brought genuine emotional shading to characters who, within the compressed structure of a nearly 3 hour film juggling three storylines, had comparatively little screen time in which to be established. Christopher Lee Saruman, though appearing in less of the film than in Fellowship of the Ring, continued to be cited by reviewers as a model of controlled theatrical villainy, lending scenes set in Isengard a sense of menace that several critics contrasted favorably with the more overtly monstrous, action oriented villainy of the Uruk-hai forces under his command. Trade and mainstream press coverage echoed this enthusiasm. In Variety, Todd McCarthy judged that the film had a tighter narrative focus and more forward momentum than the more episodic first installment had shown, a view echoed by a number of critics who felt Jackson had grown more confident in balancing spectacle against character work now that the trilogy's world building was already established. Peter Travers, reviewing for Rolling Stone, called the film spectacular in every sense, suggesting that its visual and emotional impact was strong enough to affect viewers regardless of their familiarity with Tolkien's invented terminology and lore. The Hollywood Reporter's original review, published around the time of the film's debut, predicted confidently that the film would dominate the holiday box office and stood a real chance of becoming the first sequel nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, framing the film's prospects in explicitly award season terms even before its release. Not every notice was uniformly glowing. Some critics, including reviewers writing for religious and culturally focused outlets, argued that the film's efficiency and forward drive came at some cost to the sense of wonder and dread that had distinguished the first installment, suggesting that images such as the ring wraiths or the Eye of Sauron felt somewhat less potent on their second appearance in the series, even as they judged the film an accomplished piece of filmmaking overall by any ordinary standard. Criticism, where it appeared, tended to cluster around a handful of recurring points. Some reviewers found the film's structure necessarily cutting among three separate storylines that do not converge, to be occasionally disorienting or uneven in pacing, with a small number of critics arguing that the constant movement between threads prevented any one storyline from building sustained momentum. Others focused specifically on departures from Tolkien's novel, with the altered characterization of Faramir drawing particular attention and some pointed criticism from readers and reviewers who felt strongly attached to the character's more straightforwardly noble portrayal in the book. The introduction and expansion of material involving Arwen was likewise noted by some as a significant deviation from the source, introduced primarily to serve the film's dramatic and romantic needs rather than reflecting the balance of Tolkien's text. A smaller minority of reviews, generally more mixed than negative, found the film's heavy emphasis on spectacle and combat, reflecting the greater proportion of action driven material in the second volume of the novel compared with the first, to be somewhat wearying at nearly 3 hours in length, with at least one review describing the cumulative effect of the film's darker, battle heavy second half as, in that critic's word, more exhausting than exhilarating by its conclusion. These reservations, however, remain distinctly minority positions within the overall body of critical response, which skewed heavily and consistently toward praise. General audience response, as distinct from professional critical response, was similarly enthusiastic and has remained so in the years since. User driven rating platforms that track long term audience sentiment rather than only reviews published around the time of release have consistently placed the film among the more highly rated titles of its era, and it has appeared for many years on user compiled rankings of the greatest films ever made, reflecting a durability of reputation that extends well beyond the immediate award season and box office context of its original release. Exit polling data gathered at the time of release, alongside the film's strong and sustained weekly box office holds through the crowded holiday period, reinforced the sense among industry observers that critical acclaim and popular enthusiasm for the film were closely aligned rather than diverging, a pattern that had also held true for Fellowship of the Ring and that would hold true again the following year for Return of the King. giving the trilogy as a whole an unusually consistent record of both critical and commercial success across all three of its installments. The film's reception was also reflected in a substantial run of major awards recognition during the 2002 to 2003 awards season. The Two Towers received six Academy Award nominations, including a nomination for Best Picture, and won two competitive Oscars for Best Sound Editing and for Best Visual Effects, the latter continuing a run of visual effects recognition for Weta Digital that had begun with the first film in the trilogy and would continue with the third. At the British Academy Film Awards, the film received nine nominations and won in the category of Best Special Visual Effects, one of a handful of films that year to take home multiple BAFTA awards. It also performed strongly at genre specific and critics organizations awards, the Saturn Awards, presented by the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horror Films, named it Best Fantasy Film and gave it wins in several additional categories, including Best Supporting Actor for Andy Serkis, Best Makeup, and Best Costumes, alongside a further slate of nominations covering direction, writing, acting, music, and effects. The Online Film Critics Society yeared at its awards for 2002 and also recognized the film's editors, Michael Horton and Jabez Olsen, for their work assembling the picture's three interwoven storylines. Howard Shore's score, and specifically his work on the film, was honored with the Grammy Award, adding a further mark of recognition to the film's already extensive collection of prizes and nominations across the technical acting and overall achievement categories in which it competed. Beyond these, the film was recognized by the American Film Institute among its selections honoring the year's notable films and television, and it drew nominations from critics groups across the country, including bodies such as the Chicago Film Critics Association, which nominated the film for its top prize alongside recognition for Jackson's direction, the writing team's screenplay, Howard Shore's score, and Andrew Lesnie's cinematography. Taken together, industry tallies compiled after the full 2002 2003 awards cycle credit the film with dozens of individual wins and well over 100 nominations across critics' organizations, guild bodies, and major award shows internationally, a volume of recognition that placed it among the most honored studio releases of that awards season. Even though, as with Fellowship of the Ring before it, the film's biggest prizes at the major global bodies would ultimately be reserved for its concluding installment the following year. In the years since its release, The Two Towers has generally continued to be regarded as a high point of large scale studio filmmaking from its era, frequently appearing on best of lists devoted to fantasy cinema sequels and visual effects achievement. It maintains a strong standing with general audiences as well as critics on aggregator and ranking platforms that track long term popularity rather than only reviews from the time of release. And the Battle of Helm's Deep, in particular, has continued to be cited by film writers, other filmmakers, and visual effects practitioners in the years since as one of the benchmark achievements in staging large scale battle sequences on film, credited both for its blend of practical and digital techniques and for the technical innovation represented by Veta's massive crowd simulation software, elements of which influenced approaches to large scale digital crowds in numerous subsequent productions beyond the Lord of the Rings franchise itself. On Deck 18, 2002, Peter Jackson unveiled the middle chapter of his Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Two Towers. The film went on to nab six Oscar nominations at the 75th Academy Awards. The Hollywood Reporter's original review is below. Well, on its way to becoming one of the greatest achievements in cinema history, with last year's Oscar winning first installment, filmmaker Peter Jackson's grand realization of The Lord of the Rings epic by J.R.R. Tolkien continues with The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. The much anticipated new line release is destined to rule the holiday season box office and rival the first film's theatrical earnings of $860 million worldwide. while it's not likely to spellbind Academy members enough to muster the 13 Oscar nominations that The Fellowship of the Ring received, the 3 hour fantasy adventure has good shot at being the first Best Picture nominated sequel released a year after the original since The Bells of St. Mary's 57 years ago. Meanwhile, some who found Fellowship a ponderous opening act will be happier with the quickened pace and expanded scope of Towers. For those familiar with the 1,300-page book that has been marketed as a trilogy since the 1960s, the present film is assurance that next year's Return of the King should be a truly glorious event. Indeed, assuming the better and longer extended version of Fellowship released last month on video is not a fluke, sometime in 2004, the unabridged Lord of the Rings will join very few other masterworks destined to stand up for decades and hopefully bring good fortune to all involved in its making. No character puts on the ring of power in Towers, and there is no summation of the first film to explain its importance, but the increasingly heavy and dangerous burden carried by the hobbits Frodo, Elijah Wood, and Sam Sean Astin, and the mission to destroy it is still the hope of the free peoples of Middle Earth on the eve of a great war. The title refers to Orthanc, the stronghold of treacherous wizard Saruman, Christopher Lee, and Barad-dûr, the fortress of the Dark Lord Sauron. The latter is unable to take human form but exists as a giant fiery eye. Towers follows several storylines that introduce new characters, take the viewer to new parts of Middle Earth, and, except for one, build to thunderous climaxes that moviegoers will long remember. What has taken thousands of artisans to forge cannot easily be summed up in one review. The performances continue to be richer and more satisfying than one expects in such a fantastic tale. The special effects, including two wonderful new CGI characters, are simply tremendous. The pacing is tighter than Fellowship, though they are the same length. Still, one can imagine the extended towers running even longer than the 208-minute video version of Fellowship. Along with the corrosive yet crucially helpful Gollum, Andy Serkis, a hobbit warped and driven mad by possessing the One Ring for hundreds of years, Towers presents another amazing CGI character in Treebeard, voiced by John Rhys Davies, one of the race of Ents. While Frodo goes against the wishes of Sam and others in keeping Gollum alive, providing a central drama that subtly builds a relationship that will come to a world saving climax in return. Treebeard, with the help of captured hobbits Merry, Dominic Monaghan, and Pippin Billy Boyd, gathers his kind for an assault on Saruman, very tall and more tree than human. Very tall and more talks like one, Treebeard is older than Gandalf and reluctant to battle Sauron's forces until he sees the massacre of trees ordered by Saruman in the first film. What may sound like a subplot involving the knights who say "ni" is rendered so carefully as to achieve its potential as one of the most magical and heroic parts of Rings. But Towers has many battles, starting with the opening sequence of Gandalf, Ian McKellen, locked in combat with the fiery Balrog from the first film in a dazzling plunge into the depths of the earth. Gandalf does return from his ordeal, though changed and focused on the coming war. All of the returning characters continue to evolve, including an outright mystical sequence showing the Eldar Eden Union and future of Elf Arwen, Liv Tyler and human Aragorn Mortensen, which the filmmakers went to the appendix of Rings to find for the midway point of the whole work. The major event of Towers is the Battle of Helm's Deep, in which Aragorn, Gimli the dwarf, Rhys Davies, and elf Legolas, Orlando Bloom, join the Horse Lords of Rohan in a seemingly doomed fight against Saruman's army of 10,000 Uruk-hai, orcs, and Easterlings. But first, Gandalf has to help revive King Theoden, Bernard Hill, who has fallen under the spell of Saruman and his wicked ally Worm Tongue, Brad Dourif. Other heroic Rohirrim include sister and brother Eowyn, Miranda Otto, and Eomer, Carl Urban, who is banished by the possessed Theoden. Eowyn falls for Aragorn, but wants most to fight. She gets her chance in one of the great clashes to come in return. As for the assault on Helm's Deep, made possible through the astounding special effects, and live action filming that reportedly took months. It's an amazing thing to behold. Overall, from the brief glimpses of Oliphant's giant elephant like creatures employed by Sauron's forces returning in a big way in the next movie, and the Nazgul, or ring wraiths, now mounted on fell flying creatures, to the wargs, orc mounts that are a mixture of three animals, and those revengeful ants, towers is a cinematic flood of spectacular proportions. But what strikes one more than anything in Towers is the material's dreamlike quality, from Frodo falling into the dead marshes and the way Gollum slithers on all fours, to the massive black gates of Mordor and Gandalf's climactic charge on Shadowfax, the lord of all horses, down a very steep hill. The one misgiving is the very ending, which seems less satisfying than the vile treachery of Gollum, now set for the opening of Return. The biggest frustration is having to wait now until Deck 17 2003 to complete the journey. In this extended version of the second part of the Tolkien trilogy, Frodo Baggins and the other members of the Fellowship continue on their sacred quest to destroy the One Ring, but on separate paths, starring Elijah Wood, Sean Astin, Viggo Mortensen, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Kate Blanchett, Dominic Monaghan, Orlando Bloom, Christopher Lee, Billy Boyd, John Rhys Davies, Andy Serkis, Bernard Hill, Hugo Weaving, Miranda Otto, David Venom, Brad Dourif, Carl Urban, Craig Parker. But Jackson was just following Tolkien's lead, one might say. No, in fact, Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings as a six-part narrative, bound for convenience in three volumes, and it was partially Jackson Company's efforts to force it into a three-part structure that gave the film some of their narrative problems. But this is surely not the time for that conversation. From this site's review of A Few Dollars, Maury guess is the time for that conversation now. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, if you haven't read it, is divided into six books. Book I is the story of Frodo Baggins' journey into the greater world to destroy an evil ring, while Book 2 follows the fellowship that has gathered to protect him on the longest, though not most dangerous leg of his quest. They are gathered into the volume The Fellowship of the Ring. Book 3 follows several members of the Fellowship west of the Great River in two groups and more or less describes the act of preparing for a great war. Book IV follows Frodo and his faithful friend and servant Sam Gamgee as they wander through a very small patch of very dangerous wilderness, aided and threatened in equal measure by the ring's former owner, a monstrous thing called Gollum. We need concern ourselves with books V and Veer right now, but they follow the same pattern. Everybody who isn't Frodo and Sam followed by just Frodo and Sam. Because books 3 and IV are collected into volume 2, The Two Towers, and it was this book that was nominally adapted into Peter Jackson's second part of his unbelievably ambitious and costly cinematic version of Tolkien's lengthy work, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers from 2002. I say nominally because of all three films Jackson directed and co-wrote with Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens. The Two Towers includes by far the most invention, particularly in the case of a major character who is virtually unrecognizable from the form he took in the novel, requiring a climax that doesn't resemble anything that the original author ever wrote in all his considerable body of work, both published and unpublished. And thus we come to that question of how one ought to adapt The Lord of the Rings in six parts or three or two, one of which never gets produced. The difficulty in filming The Two Towers as Tolkien wrote it is that Book 3 covers a significantly shorter period of time than Book RV, and while this communicated only through implication in the book itself, we call practice obsessive reader, hidden away for the kind of obsessive reader who won't start something that ultimately pointless at the risk of turning the story into a math exercise. We call them Tolkien's fan base. It ends up being really quite significant in the last book, The Return of the King, where the Frodo and Sam plot is wrapped up in hardly any time at all because it was so much more advanced by the end of The Two Towers. Meaning that if you want to do what Jackson and company did and cross cut between books 3 and IV, you're going to end up out of balance, but the fun is just starting. Unlike the Fellowship of the Ring, which ends with a momentous point of decision making and can function relatively well as a single narrative arc, as demonstrated just the year prior in Jackson's adaptation, the only one of his trilogy that's genuinely effective as a movie considered separately from the other two. The Two Towers doesn't really climax, but stop. So, in order to leave audiences feeling like they just saw a movie, the writers pull back even farther, adapting only the first seven of Book Three's 11 chapters. In fact, in both plot lines, they stop at nearly an identical point to Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated The Lord of the Rings, a dreadful film that influenced Jackson's first two movies more than I think he's ever willingly admitted. And thus, Book IV would have to be cut back even more, or they could just throw out a huge portion of that segment and make shit up, which they did. Making things even worse, The Two Towers is the shortest of the three parts of The Lord of the Rings, and proportionately the least dense with plot points, making this the most stretched out of the movies, or if you prefer, as I do, the least rushed. The worst of all this monkeying around wouldn't be felt until the following year's The Lord of the Rings. The Return of the King, and we'll discuss it when we turn to that movie. But in the meanwhile, I think there's enough to go on. Turning six overlapping books into three movies turned into a logistical nightmare for Jackson and company, which could only be resolved in the case of The Two Towers by using Tolkien's book as a guide, but hardly the specific blueprint that it was in the case of The Fellowship of the Ring, the most faithful of the three movies. By far, as a direct result, the Two Towers has received by far the most criticism from the Tolkien faithful, for whom this is a good movie and this is a slavishly accurate recreation of the book on celluloid, are identical propositions. And by virtue of containing neither a beginning nor an ending, true of the book as well, but exacerbated by the specific place where the film ends. The book's last sentence is more of a cut to black. Like the series finale of The Sopranos, it has generally received the most dubious response from normal people audiences, though criticism and dubious must be understood to be very relative terms. It was still one of the highest grossing movies of 2002 and continues to enjoy an altogether rosy reputation. Anyway, though I consider myself a Tolkien fan, I am also not a fanatic, and the very same freewheeling liberties it takes with the book is partially why The Two Towers is and has always been my favorite movie in the trilogy. I find that the scale of its departure from the source material had a liberating effect on my as a moviegoer, and where even now a little piece me, it was a much bigger piece in 2001, still mentally checks the Fellowship of the Ring constantly against the book. I don't have that problem with its sequel. And I don't think that my particular relationship to the material is really at issue either. The changes made to the source material open up the plot a great deal, letting the movie work as a movie and less of a museum piece. That is to say, the endless walking around fighting things that sometimes bogs down the first movie simply isn't an issue here, as fewer events are given a bit more space and the whole thing conforms more to movie rules. Unlike the other two movies in the trilogy, The Two Towers has motifs and themes that are woven throughout, not the message of The Lord of the Rings as a whole, but ideas that are teased out and echoed in different places. The flip side is that by insistently and rightfully refusing to incorporate a recap, the film opens with a revised version of one of the most important scenes from Fellowship, in which we see a great deal of what went on afterward. For more depth and foreshadowing, The Two Towers doesn't have an opening, but just plunges us right into the action. And since everything about the ending is designed to lead into the return of the king, it doesn't have a conclusion either. So, even though the film is given more of a chance to tell its own story in a more cinematic idiom than Fellowship, its own story doesn't, in point of fact, exist. We are given instead just a dramatic fragment, and given what the whole Lord of the Rings movie project was, that's not inherently an evil thing, though it makes it a bit hard to take it seriously. But The odds of someone only seeing just this one movie out of the three strikes me as being extremely small. Far worse for the film's narrative structure is that there are three entirely distinct plots happening. Two of them are both from Book 3, Human Aragorn, Viggo Mortensen, Elf Legolas, Orlando Bloom, and Dwarf Gimli, John Rhys Davies, are hunting orcs that have stolen their friends but are redirected to the primitive kingdom of Rohan to help its king Theoden Bernard Hill prepare for war against the traitorous wizard Saruman, Christopher Lee. While hobbits Merry, Dominic Monaghan, and Pippin, Billy Boyd, the orcs' captives, are able to escape and encounter the massive tree like ants, chief among them Treebeard, voiced by Rhys Davies, spending virtually their whole sequence of the movie attempting to convince the Ents to move against Saruman. And these at least take place in reference to one another concerning broadly the same immediate conflict. But the book IV material in which Frodo, Elijah Wood, and Sam Sean Astin trap the corrupted Gollum, Andy Serkis, in the performance that made motion capture a thing, who was a hobbit like person for his 500-year ownership of the ring, turned him into basically a monster and forced him to take them to the closed off land of Mordor, doesn't really intersect with the book 3 material whatsoever. And the game attempts by the four screenwriters, Jackson, Walsh, and Boyens joined for just this one film by Steven Sinclair to find places to cut in between the various subplots doesn't do very much to convince us that there is any such intersection. Still, all of the stories, connected or not, march along with considerably more assurance and smoothness than the desperately crammed Fellowship of the Ring. My single greatest structural complaint about that film, that it's impossible to tell how long events are meant to take, does not apply to its sequel. It's not the only way in which the second movie is, for my taste, a marked improvement. The acting is very nearly across the board better, though Elijah Wood, who made for an awfully good callow young hero in the first movie, flails about pointlessly for most of the film, being thoroughly outacted by Aston Serkis's CGI alter ego and some of the more well positioned trees and rocks until he gets something more active and dramatic to play near the end. And Ian McKellen's Gandalf, returned all Christ figure like, lacks the twinkle and old man charm that he had in such quantities in the last film. Where the cast really thrives is in the new characters. Hill's Theoden is a terrific depiction of royalty in self doubt, and his interactions with Mortensen's king in waiting are some of the best acted scenes in the whole trilogy. Theoden's niece, Eowyn, played by Miranda Otto, is pretty much the only interesting female character in the franchise. And even then, the filmmakers play up the lovelorn angle relative to the books, and Otto does much better than the blank Liv Tyler or the stilted Kate Blanchett in the last movie, David Venom's Faramir. The human warrior who captures Frodo and Sam at the midpoint and proceeds to send the film spinning into brand new plot lines that Tolkien never imagined is a wonderful depiction of the military man as wounded soul, though most of his best stuff is left to the extended cut, as we'll discuss presently. The best, of course, is Serkis's Gollum Smeagol, and in fact, his work in this film competes only with McKellen's in Fellowship as the absolute finest acting in the trilogy. His showpiece scene, in which the murderous, thieving Gollum half of his broken psychology quarrels with the guilt ridden, pathetic Smeagol half, is my favorite moment in all the many hours of The Lord of the Rings. And as Jackson has recently admitted, the scene was directed by Fran Walsh. Take that as you will. The point, though, is Gollum as a performance and a character, not subtle but damnably effective. And not only is Serkis's work surprisingly sensitive and nuanced, given the technological wall between him and the rest of the movie, the effects work itself is deservedly legendary. Gollum was easily the best visual effects work in CGI history at his O2 debut, and while he's been surpassed a few times since then, Avatar, The Recent Life of Pi, the Jackson Circus collaboration King Kong, it's shocking how much better Gollum has aged than pretty much any other 10-year-old CGI you could think of. Compare, for example, Spider Man from the same year, which looks absolutely rinky dink now, not just because his realism remains largely intact, but because of the care and detail put into his visual personality by a very talented roster of effects artists, visual effects made with love that will, for that reason, still look good 50 years on, just like Ray Harryhausen's skeleton warriors in Jason and the Argonauts do today, or going even further back, the Parade of Wonders in Alexander Korda's production of The Thief of Baghdad. In fact, the visual effects throughout hold up extremely well. What doesn't look great by the standards of 2012 already didn't look great by the standards of 2002. And this is true of the whole trilogy, though The Two Towers has my favorite effects overall simply because there was too much obvious CGI in The Return of the King, while The Fellowship of the Ring overplayed its hand in the Moria sequence. I simply don't like the design of the place and the demonic Balrog, regardless of their technical quality. Other points of improvement. The overbearing score in the first movie gives way to something far more elegiac and thoughtful. There is, in particular, a theme associated with Rohan that I think is undoubtedly the best piece of music in the trilogy and maybe even Howard Shaw's entire career, and Andrew Lesnie's cinematography, with fewer points at which the technically impressive and even more technically daunting forced perspective used to make normal sized actors look like they're under 4 feet, has more of a chance to breathe and not default so often to easy look at how painterly my vistas are. Grandeur, though there is still a great deal of that, certainly the editing is massively improved, if only because it is more coherent. The editors were the only crew head swapped out between projects so that all three movies could be in post simultaneously. Michael Horton steps in here, replacing John Gilbert, and as a direct result, the action is better. The massive film ending battle at Helm's Deep might very well be the best battle scene in American cinema of the Ozeros, a tremendous improvement from the busy, choppy fight scenes in Fellowship. And then there are the points where the Two Towers doesn't quite measure up. As a work of design, it's not remotely as interesting in large part because there are fewer locations, but the locations we see also aren't as impressive. The Rohan court at Edoras and the fortress of Helm's Deep are both lavish and costly, but they look an awful lot like a lot of movies set in England and Scandinavia around the 8th century or so. And the ruined city of Osgiliath, for the first time in the series, looks like a set. Towers and walls where they need to be for striking visuals and blocking, not because they feel right. I guess Moria felt like a set, but it was more fantastic. Osgiliath is comparatively prosaic, and thus its inauthenticity is heightened. The only point where the second film comes even close to matching the first is its impossible depiction of the Mordor Gate, a titanic slab of shiny black that has all the atmosphere and detail of the best fantasy. There's also Jackson's directing. He switched out one problem for another, and while his inability to switch tones has been obviated, if not replaced, The Two Towers has a script that requires less tonal flexibility than The Fellowship of the Ring. He introduces a much nastier trick this time around, a crippling affection for using helicopter shots everywhere, including, in one gruesome moment, a helicopter shot right onto the battlements of Helm's Deep, where Theoden and Aragorn discuss strategy. If there's one thing a helicopter shot should never be used for, it's a dialogues scene. It all comes down to the same problem as before. Jackson is too overawed at his own movie and can't stop showing it off to look as big and epic as possible. There's less domesticity inherent in the material this time around, but it's still the case that Jackson's sprawl is always at the expense of the humanity of the story, and only the extra strength of the human element this time around, coming mostly in the form of Aragorn and Gollum Frodo's charm, the former given an increasingly deep and conflicted arc, the latter featuring in several three-way conflicts that were already the most piercing character scenes in Tolkien's novel, and thus inherently primed to be the best in the movies, keeps the Two Towers from descending fully into spectacle at the expense of feeling. Certainly, the director does not fight that impulse. And now a word on the extended cut. It is not nearly as all round wonderful as in Fellowship. For one thing, it ends up producing a 223-minute long film, and at some point in there, one needs to seriously start to consider where the padding can be snipped out. But unlike the previous film, where every single addition deepened the characters, the world, or both, the only exception, the cameo from the stone trolls of The Hobbit, blatant fan service, very few of the additions here are actually vital. In fact, only the expanded scenes with Faramir, who we now discover has a severe case of daddy issues that explain and even justify his harsh treatment of Frodo, actively improve the movie. Some of the additions are admittedly more welcome than not. Several short scenes near the end give the film a bit more of a wing down than the okay, we're done, see you next year feel of the theatrical cut. And I am generally fond of the light humor given to Gimli in several expanded moments, though this would pay off terribly in the last movie. But far too much of the added material is strictly to depict more of the book just for the sake of it. A wandering dialogue scene that exists largely to establish that Aragorn is 87 years old, because that's germane, or a scene about elven rope that was charming in the book, but here means only that the movie gets saddled with two different scenes which both function in the blocking and the dialogue, like the opening scene of the movie, which thus feels redundant and draggy from the word go. None of it actively hurts the movie, but it does slow it down. And the one thing you don't want from a nearly 4 hour commitment is undue slowness.